Good afternoon. I am Evan Smith, and I'm here to talk about the old AACIS, the predecessor to ADEIL. You can see that my background is blurred, and it's partly deliberate because we're looking back to a past from long ago. In 1992, there were about 70 independent study institutions in the United States, so I'm told. Independent study being a code for independent study by correspondence or just correspondence. It was primarily print. Sometimes people were using video cassettes and audio cassettes and so on, but it was basically a print industry. And study guides were put together with binding strips and so on. It was that kind of era. So in 1992, it was pretty much then that AACIS was conceived. It's hard to say exactly when because it built on the time schedule of what is now AACIS and then was NUCEA. They had an independent study division and they had a workshop, usually in November. And that time slot was used to advertise the beginning of AACIS. I think some T-shirts and business cards and membership cards were passed out. The first year was free, so it was easy to get a lot of people in. We have to kind of gloss the name, AACIS. Okay, American, easy enough. We weren't thinking very internationally at that time. Association, that's pretty obvious. Collegiate, the C is for collegiate. That doesn't mean college level only. It means college hosted. So that sometimes caused confusion later on when people had high school programs or even younger age groups. And the IS, of course, is independent study. And it was not about the rugged individualist studying alone. It was about studying alone through correspondence. So it's very different from the teams and the synchronous chats and so on that we have today. So there was a workshop at Chapel Hill, and a lot of things were passed out. And at that point, I think we already knew that the University of Missouri would have the first conference in '93. So we had people come in largely from the Midwest because a lot of the programs were based in the Midwest. NUCEA had regions, Region 4 and 5, covered a lot of the Midwest. We all knew each other. We competed for awards just as people do now. A lot of the schools that were on the radar screen were Indiana, Minnesota, various Illinois schools, several Texas schools, Oklahoma, and so on, and of course, Missouri. So we hosted in '93, and I was on at least 2 panels. We had a fairly good attendance. And the next year was '94 at Penn State, also co-hosted by Thomas Edison State College, as it was then called. And there were a lot of attendees from South Africa, most of whom did not become members the next year. So there was an international side to it, but it was not necessarily prophetic at that point. In 1995, something else happened that is significant, at least socially, and that is that there was a Colorado consortium of institutions. I don't think that exists anymore, but it was headed by Cheryl Darling by name. And she said, please dress down next year. No suits and ties, no dresses, let's dress down. And that was aided by the fact that we were making T-shirts and sweatshirts with AACIS on them. We had an AACIS banner, we had AACIS this and that. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, there were excursions, there were people you knew from other conferences, you could compare notes. Even if you didn't go to some of the presentations, you talked in the hallway about office politics or where are we going with our field and that sort of thing. We weren't sure where technology would take us at that point, but people were introducing ideas like, do you have a website? What will you put on your website? Will you have online courses and how will they work? So it was very new, maybe primitive to some people who are on today, but someone had to do it. In the 1990s, we continued with newsletters, and they were often 2 or 3 times a year. The first one was what we did at the last conference and what else is new, and here's how to submit for awards and so on. Here's how to join committees. And the next one was usually what are we expecting in the next conference. Sometimes we would know a year in advance. We tried to do that. There were a few times where we knew 2 years in advance, or we had competition. One time it was between Austin, Texas and Athens, Ohio. Austin won initially, but Athens, Ohio certainly presented the next time around. So we weren't doing any of these virtual conferences. I don't think the technology existed for that, except maybe some primitive form of satellite or something. So there was a lot face-to-face and a lot about the written word. We had varied locations. I mentioned the central Midwest, but more and more we would get a few people from Berkeley, we'd get some people from Nevada, Utah, and so on. And the awards were patterned a little bit after NUCEA. People would try and argue over, should we have honorable mention? Should we have runners up? Should it just be one award? What if somebody is half a point apart from someone else? How do we deal with that? And the answers were not always hard and fast. Sometimes a new committee or a new committee chair would come in and things would be redecided. We also had some talk about good practices at various times. And in the meantime, NUCEA was changing too. They were becoming UCEA. They dropped the N from national and were just University Continuing Ed Association. And they had a distance learning community of practice, or DLCOP. So that supposedly represented changes that were going on in the institutions at the time. Some of us were not sure about that, but that's what they were saying. And so that caused a reshuffling of committees, and some people were on ACES committees as well as NUCEA. Some people did some of both. Some people were told join one, but not the other. So we had a lot of that going on. And sometimes it got a little bit confusing. Is this award that group or is it from the other group? We did have one that was for the first time named for a woman, the Helen Williams Award, which is one that came out of the University of Iowa. And the late Von Pittman integrated that into independent study. So a lot of awards, a lot of recognition. We also used to put out surveys and collect data. And that sometimes became difficult because as we worked on the web, there were occasions when either a hurricane or an act of hacking came in and made it very difficult for those in the South, where a lot of people belong to ACES, could help out. But we got through. Even if we had to print things off or wait a couple of years, we soldiered on. At one point, the University of Arizona, I believe it was, came up with lower level courses, middle school or junior high. So that was something interesting. And we would write about things like that in our newsletters. We would have somebody present about it. And in some of the data collections, somebody would bring up the idea, are we dealing with apples and oranges? Because if you're comparing it to the classroom, where you've got a cohort or a face-to-face group, is that the same thing that we're doing? I know some of those issues come up again. With online, is the student working alone? Who are they working with? And what about asynchronous development, things like that? But the newsletter went on. If it had to be done on email, as I think it was for a while, it was done that way. Later on, it was online. We had listserv discussions, and a lot of people compared notes. If you didn't find out something at the conference, you probably did on the listserv by saying, do you have online exams yet? Or what do you do about proctors? Or what do you do once a course wins an award? Do you show it to other people? Does it change your design system? Some of the same things that go on today. And of course, the board. The board was part of, you might say, a non-democratic side of ACES. It decided a lot of things. We had more people who knew each other face to face because we weren't dealing with COVID or the opportunities of Skype or Zoom or something like that. So we conversed about a lot of things, shared information. Some people even did benchmarking. There was a David Brigham, who I think was, well, he had several jobs. He was based at various institutions, and he would do benchmarking and try to show how each institution did certain things and how it compared to others and what were the best practices and so on. After a while, I think it was actually during the ADEIL period, we did not do the surveys anymore. There was also a lot of mainstreaming going on campuses. So if you're mainstreamed, then is it possible that the academic unit is paying the instructors, or are you, meaning whatever unit you're part of, and so on? Because with places like Missouri, for example, it's a land grant institution. So there's an agricultural history. And if you're under extension, sometimes there's special rules for things you can do or can't do. So if the rest of the campus goes with Blackboard, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to adopt that. It may eventually, but early on, it wasn't always that way. And of course, there were discussions once we got into the web. What is the right format to use? Do you want something like WebCT? Do you turn off certain features that don't apply to independent study? Do you use Blackboard? What do you do about incompletes? There were institutions that were becoming more and more semester-based, whereas independent study wasn't. So if you're on the semester system, how does that affect the beginning and end? When do students register? Is there an open period? Or do you tend to cluster it around fall or spring or even summer? And do you have winter sessions and so on? So a lot of that was going on. And we spent a lot of time on conference preparation too, because we had to have, in the early days, we had to have big banners and posters. I mean, it had to be drawn out by artists and mailed somehow or other in tubes or something, or brought face to face. At one point, we also tried having a mentoring program where you bring somebody in and show them around, but I think that didn't work. I think it lasted only a year or two because most people caught on under their own guise. They didn't really need somebody to show them around so much, but it was helpful. It is nice when you're at a new conference to have someone say, "Well, this is typical of what we do," or don't miss that award session or something like that. Some of the same highlights that we have now. Now, there was a controversy over having a new name. I'm supposed to go only up to 2009, but that is when we went into ADEIL and we tried many different things, many different things. By then, there were a lot of other distance ed organizations. Did we want the A, if any, to stand for American? Probably not. A lot of people thought maybe it was time to get rid of the American connotation. If we use DE, what other organizations have DE in there? If we use IS, independent study, is anybody saying that very much? What does independent learning, IL, mean? If anything different from independent study. But it was a great time. It was a lot of fun. You know, people would say, "Oh, I don't have to worry about wardrobe. I'll just bring a bunch of sweatshirts or something." Men and women alike. And of course, there are a lot more women in the organization. It was, I guess, part of the patriarchy, you might say, in the early days. And there were a lot of suits and ties until we went informal. So there's a little history of Americana there with some international slants too. And of course, we added research awards and other things like that, as you well know, because more and more people were getting degrees in independent study or something like that, distance ed, or teaching it. Now we have a lot of teachers in the organization. In the early days, we talked about the teachers. We weren't usually them, we talked about them. We gave them awards, we gave them instructional design, and so on, but we were more likely to talk about them or make them an invitee to come tell us how they teach face-to-face versus through some other means. So those are the basics. It's a very short conversation, but I'll be glad to take any questions or comments from people.
I'm wondering, do you remember which year the Von Pittman Research Award became the ADEIL?
Oh,
Because I got the Von
mm,
Pittman in 2014, and then later that was changed. I don't know why was it changed
yeah.
either.
Well, Terry Nagel and I got one in 2002 or 2005, something like that. So somewhere around there. We generally weren't using people's names anymore after a while. My name being an exception for that research award. But we decided to make the awards just the award for a certain category like college or university. See, someone says, I love hearing the history. You really were and are pioneers and pathmarkers. Well, we tried to be, yes. We didn't know if we were making history for sure. You know, in many cases, when people are writing a book or making a movie, they don't always know that they're going to go down in history. They just do what they can. And it was a lot of fun to look forward to it every year, whether it was in October or November. Sometimes it would one of the reasons it slanted towards October was Colorado because it gets colder sooner. So a lot of times it would fall around Columbus Day. And then you really needed your sweatshirts and your parkas and so on. But it was something to look forward to, whether you were in Estes Park or Mississippi. Okay. Anything else in the chat that I need to see? Oh yeah, posters and banners. Yeah, yeah. Now the banner was probably printed on a press of some kind, but it was probably 20 feet long and it rolled up. Okay, let's see.
Well, I hope
Anything
you'll
else?
come back next year and give us part two. This
Oh,
is
I think I
really, really
might be
interesting.
persuaded. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Evan. You
Yeah.
brought back some memories.
Well, I hope so. Okay. Thank you. And I'll see you next year, I guess.